Welcome to DIA Today, Democracy in America Today. I'm Matt Parks alongside David Corbin. Glad to have you with us to explore the ideas behind today's headlines.
My left eye sees pollution. Those dirty fuels are burning. The earth's whole climate's churning. Clean energy solution. My right eye scans the bill. Fossil fuels are cheap. Wind and solar too steep. Drill, baby, drill. Predefined, misaligned, polarized division. Shuttered mind, worse than blind. 2020 vision.
So Dave, back from New England?
Great time. We were there for a little under a week and managed to hit New York, as I had mentioned in the last show, Maine, and then Boston. So we had a great time. One thing that you realize kind of living in, having lived in Texas and now living in Colorado, these bigger states, it's just crazy how much ground you can cover in New England, all in the matter of like 4 or 5 days. So we had a great time, had our fill of lobster and steamers and all that good stuff, had good weather for the most part. Saw Red Sox win against the Royals. So just a great time. Couldn't have scripted a better trip. And then now home in Colorado, and the younger people in our family are visiting. My daughter Catherine, her boyfriend Cam, who it's perfect for this week's show, is a law student. He's going into his third year at Notre Dame Law. And my son Patrick, who you know very well. Three of them are here for the week. So we've had back-to-back excellent weeks, end of the summer. Kids are back in school. They started school on Monday.
They did? Wow.
That's early. It's just so different. I mean, I imagine you start up there in New York in early September, maybe late August. I don't know. But I always remember Labor Day being the marker. So
Right. Yeah, we're starting the day after Labor Day, or maybe the day after that. We're homeschooling, but our co-op doesn't meet till the following week, so we kind of have to get a running start to get ready for the first day there. But yeah, it's nice to still have about 3 weeks to go. I think the kids are feeling a little bit of the pressure of it's coming down the pike, and the freedom is beginning to wane. But we've had a nice stretch here because we did our vacation early, and so we've been home already now for more than a month and have another 3 weeks to go. So it's, we haven't really done that. Typically we've been away middle of the summer for 4 or 5 weeks. So it's been kind of nice to just have that time here and to just kind of settle into the summer routine. I guess we'll hear more about Saratoga at the end of the show, but eager to get the final accounting there. So we are in episode 5 of 6, working our way through the chapters from our 2010 book, Keeping Our Republic, Principles for Political Reformation. And so we're up to lawfulness today, which I think is an interesting topic. There's always things in the headlines that we can connect these things to. There were back in 2010, there are today, and I guess every day in between. But Dave, you want to set the stage just a little bit for us as we jump back into this series?
Sure. So we've covered 4 principles thus far. We have a total of 6, and of course our argument is if we're going to have a political reformation of any impact, we have to return to these principles. The first principle we covered was the principle of equality, that a society operates well when it has a rule of justice that recognizes the equal dignity of all men. Secondly, responsibility, the principle of responsibility, that we as human beings are moral agents. We live our lives before God and others, and we have an obligation to give an accounting of why we did what we did, why we made the choices that we made. Third, honor. Ambition is part of who we are as human beings, but there can be high ambition and low ambition. A society that is running well has political leaders, cultivates those leaders so that they're committed to the common good, not just acting in a way that benefits themselves as individuals, which leads them to act as demagogues or office seekers or Caesars in the extreme case. Finally, last show, we covered the principle of justice, which seems to bring it all together. What is politics about? It aims toward justice. It aims toward the idea that those who rule should rule with the common good in mind and be wary of faction and factious activity. of individuals, regardless of their ideology, regardless of their party, acting in a way that separates, that divides, rather than unifies people with an aim toward the common good. So lawfulness is our next principle. And how would you define the principle of lawfulness?
This is one that's interesting because, we'll talk about some of the tensions here that are inherent within these principles, but also how it builds upon some of the things you were just describing. So lawfulness, or the rule of law, as often referred to in public debate, has to do with a presumption that you follow the law as given, and particularly the fundamental law. In the United States, that means following the Constitution primarily, and of course that means the U.S. Constitution, but also state constitutions. We are a people that has recorded our laws, that has established those by formal processes. Not every country does that. Not every country has a formal constitution, but we do. We cherish that. It's been around for 240 or so years. And so it's really important to think about that as a bedrock for our political system, and to not make frequent appeals to things like expediency, usefulness, necessity, where it's not really necessity. These are the kinds of things we've seen, especially over the last 100 or so years, as people, especially on the left, have found the Constitution to be somewhat constraining in terms of their overall political project. And so they would say, well, the Constitution shouldn't stand in the way of good things, shouldn't get in the way of things that we know are important in this moment or are even necessary, we believe, given some particular crisis or situation. And so we want to talk about how we really understand the rule of law in light of our historical commitment to lawfulness and constitutionalism, and to push back a little bit on some of these excuses that are often made now, as much on the right perhaps as on the left, for going beyond the strictures of the Constitution, and to really see what we're losing when we give up on lawfulness as a key principle.
It's really interesting, Matt, because lawfulness as a principle, of course, connects back to those first four principles. Probably the greatest tension that is present is between lawfulness, our fifth principle, and justice. But you see that tension less, right, with the other three principles. You talk about equality. Well, equality before the law. That's the expectation, right? That the law is going to apply to each of us as equals. It's not going to be distorted so that it benefits some at the disadvantage of others. Secondly, that we have moral agency, that we have responsibility, right? That you do something, right? You have to face the consequence before the law for what you've done. And then thirdly, that we ought to honor the law, that it is a principle that holds together the common good, or can hold together the common good. When you begin to talk about justice and lawfulness, however, you get to this tension that you just mentioned, where what are we after here? Are we after a justice that goes beyond the law, or are we just going to follow the law? And you can go in either one of those directions to too great a degree and undermine your society. So talk about the limits of the principle of lawfulness. And so we're not suggesting here, right? And I when we have this discussion, it kind of reminds me of Jesus in the New Testament, talking about the law and talking about what he's doing, right? And where he's adamant, right, that the law is right and good, and yet must be understood in terms of the gospel. Right? So talk about that tension, Matt.
Yeah, that's a great example of the kind of root issue that we're dealing with here. So justice obviously is an appeal to ultimate truth, ultimate right. Capital J justice is what we're really talking about. And as historically understood, that means we're talking about things that are grounded in natural right, natural law, and the order that God has established. And so we may not find that instantiated in any given political community. We recognize that all political communities fall short of the ideal form of justice. And so where do we find that expressed? Well, we find that expressed in law. And law ought to reflect justice. Law ought to point us toward justice. Law ought to be built upon these underlying principles that we've talked about, but it often isn't. Or it sort of is and sort of isn't. And so we're constantly living with this tension. If we recognize a justice beyond our mere experience, beyond our mere will, beyond our national expression of what we think is right and wrong, if we recognize that, we have this tension we have to always deal with between the what is and the what ought to be, between the particulars of our community and the ultimately right. And so we want to make sure we understand that here at the beginning of this conversation, because we're going to emphasize, and I think rightly so, the importance of following the law. And we'll see some very strong claims by people historically. We've got some Lincoln quotes that'll help us here, and others to think about that give us a real presumption in favor of following the law. And yet we recognize the law is not the ultimate end, right? The law ought to be a means to right, ought to be a means toward justice, toward the realization of the best community attainable in a fallen world. And so where the law gets in the way of that, we have to have strategies for dealing with that. Now, it might still mean following the law up to a point until the law is changed. There might be other ways we think about that. But we have to recognize that the law as such is not justice as such.
I love that construction, and it reminds me of our mentor, Angelo Codavilla, who was always talking about means and ends.
Right.
And I think a good way to understand the relationship, the right relationship between lawfulness and justice is understand that lawfulness is the right means, justice is the right end, right? So if we're thinking, but if we make lawfulness an end, or we make our own conception of justice that can be unlawful, the means, then we get into some great problems.
Right. And there's a second topic we'll come around to as well when we think about what are the limits of obedience to law. One is, well, what if the law is unjust? And that's an important topic. We can think about there going back to, like you mentioned, Christ and Augustine and Martin Luther King and all kinds of interesting conversations there. But also one of the ways that the law can seem to be a problem is when you have a situation that the law doesn't seem to accommodate. All of a sudden you have a major crisis. You think about the attack on Pearl Harbor. What do you do that next day? Or the crisis around the Civil War? Does the law have the tools in that moment to deal with the crisis? And if it doesn't, how do you properly appeal to that necessity to go beyond the law in that moment and yet still retain respect for the underlying principle of lawfulness and constitutionalism? So those are important questions. We don't want to just pretend there's no tensions here and that the easy solution in every situation is always simply to follow the law as it's given to us.
One more thing that I'll mention, Matt, before we get into this topic is how applicable this conversation is to not only political communities, but to organizations. I ran a school organization. You did the same, and you have rules, right? But then you have the mission of the organization or the business or the corporation that you work for. So I think there's application here to a lot of aspects of our life. The application we're going to talk about is toward the American political community, but it's applicable to a lot of things.
That's a great observation. It is very practical. It has to do with family life. It has to do with church life. It has to do with business life and all these kinds of questions. And one of the challenges that you find in all those circumstances is when it doesn't seem like people are following the rules or applying them consistently, there's a real sense of injustice, unfairness, right? You'll hear that, and rightfully so in many cases, because people will think, well, it's not really about what the rules are. It's about who you know, or what angle you're playing, or what power you're able to bring to bear on a situation. And we see that all the time in our politics, but we see that oftentimes in our personal lives as well.
Well, I think that, all of this said, I think a good place to begin, Matt, and this is a place that you feel very comfortable. Your dissertation was on this part of American history, that moment in time between the founding and the Civil War, in which you tried to understand what was taking place in American politics after we declare our independence and after we have this Constitution that we rightly celebrate. And one of the things that's interesting here is that Abraham Lincoln becomes kind of the main player in American politics, but before he's even known, he makes an argument in a famous speech called the Young Men's Lyceum Address, in which he suggests that we as Americans must have a heavy presumption toward obedience to the law. And I'll just read a little part of that, and then I want to get your interpretation of what Lincoln is saying there and why Lincoln is saying it at that time in American history. So from Lincoln's argument in his Young Men's Lyceum Address: let every American Every lover of liberty, every well-wisher to his posterity, swear by the blood of the revolution never to violate, in the least particular, the laws of the country, and never to tolerate their violation by others. And he'll give some examples in this address, Matt, of the violation of the law. But why is the reverence for law so essential for Lincoln at this time in American history?
Yeah, that's great questions. This is 1838. Lincoln is only 29 years old, and he's speaking to a group of other young men who are kind of on the rise. There's a new generation that's taking over. We've gone through the founders' generation. They're all dead. Madison was the last of the founders to die a couple years before that. But really, in terms of their political power, that began to wane in the era around the War of 1812 and that period up to the Missouri Compromise. And so a new generation had arisen. We're now into the Romantic period. We're into this Jacksonian era where emotion, where passion is becoming the order of the day. In this speech, he cites a number of cases of vigilante justice that really weren't justice. And this tendency he sees for the laws to break down and for people to simply decide, you know what, I'm not waiting for local law enforcement to do their job. It takes too long. I know this person's guilty. I'm going to do something about it right now. And that was happening all over the country. And so he was seeing this rising challenge to the habits of law keeping, which we had inherited from the founders, and yet we're beginning to slip away. And recognizing the passions. And of course, this is right as the slavery issue is rising to national prominence. And so, this violence was arising not just in general, but around issues related to race and slavery. And seeing where that might lead and how much of a threat that was to the long-term survival of the Republic, Lincoln says as a young man, it's time to stop this now. We've got to understand that in this moment, obedience to the law, almost regardless of the content of the law, is what we need, because everything else is pushing us in the opposite direction. Everything else is leading us down a pathway to simply pursuing our passions and allowing the mob to govern in the place of the people.
Our podcast is titled Democracy in America Today, and it's just amazing that you have Lincoln making this argument in this address at the same time that Alexis de Tocqueville, having traveled to the United States, writes Democracy in America and notices a similar thing. And the way I always presented this to my class is that he sees something unique and special in the American experiment in self-government, that we begin as a people that wants our political independence. And yet that doesn't mean that we are going to also have as a corollary moral independence, that within the moral sphere, we must be dependent upon the truth, as you said earlier, the capital J justice. But there's a tendency when a society becomes politically independent for it to want to call the shots of morality, particularly among those who are part of a democracy and believe, as we mentioned a couple shows ago, that if the many say it's right, it must be right. So we lose our bearings and we lose our anchor in that moral dependency. So I think Lincoln sees what Tocqueville sees, that it's very easy to fall to this temptation.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lincoln's really trying to call his generation back to this earlier tradition. Now, I mean, there's some irony in that. Obviously, in establishing a new nation, they were overturning certain laws of the old. The Declaration of Independence was an unlawful act in a certain respect. And even the Constitution was in some ways an unlawful act insofar as it didn't follow all the rules of the Articles of Confederation. If you think about it as an amendment to the Articles, they didn't follow the process there. So they recognize, again, this tension between justice and lawfulness, but also the need to have this general principle that we follow the law. And there's a great exposition of the value of stability in the laws and law keeping in Federalist 62. And it's sort of a funny context because Madison's talking about the reasons you have a Senate. Right? Why not just have a House? Why not just have a single legislative body that's run by the people and responds immediately to the people's wills and desires? And so he's anticipating more turbulent times and saying, well, the Senate's going to be there, when you need it. And that Senate, as a second body, able to say, hold on just a second, let's think about that further, will promote the stability of the laws, which will ultimately be beneficial for all Americans. Now, it seems like the kind of thing say, oh, yeah, well, of course, the elite in the Senate, that'll be great for the wealthy, that'll be great for the propertied. What about the poor man, the majority? They're going to lose out. He argues the exact opposite. He argues that the problem that arises when the laws aren't stable is primarily a problem for the regular guy, who's on the make, who wants to start a business but doesn't know what the rules will be tomorrow and can anticipate, well, will regulations make this business impossible? Will the taxes change so that what was profitable today is unprofitable tomorrow? Or what about all the ways that those who are insiders can get carve-outs into the law that benefit them? As the laws multiply, as the laws change, who can keep up with it? Well, those that have a lot of accountants can, those who can pay lots of lawyers can, but the regular person, you're just trying to keep your head above water. You're just trying to run your business. Forget about all the tax and regulatory elements of it. So he goes through in this litany of examples and challenges that arise when the law is unstable, all the reasons why we would prefer, ought to strongly prefer, a principle of lawfulness to really be at the core of our political identity.
Yeah, here it reminds me of Aristotle once again, where to arrive at a good governance that provides for hope and opportunity for a political community, you have to have, as you mentioned here, in the person of the Senate, a few who respects that the many want to get ahead and they want to have the opportunity to get ahead, and lawfulness allows them to do that, but also a many who respects property and respects the rightfulness of property holders, and also through lawfulness understands that a society will run well. So the few and the many coming together, bound, I think, by the rules of lawfulness, make for an excellent society.
That's right. Lawfulness, the rule of law, is a great equalizer. It's a mechanism by which those high and low come together and have their shot and have their opportunity. And that was, of course, something that was so near and dear to Lincoln as somebody who, came from the most modest possible circumstances and was energetic, ambitious, self-educated, aimed to rise, whether it was politically or otherwise. And there was opportunity for that. And the law was one of the mechanisms, not just literally as a lawyer, but one of the mechanisms that allowed him to do that, so that he was able to eventually rise to the highest office in the land.
So if you have a law that's mutable, what are the dangers that Madison references in Federalist 62, and are they applicable today? So go through them, Matt, the ones he mentions.
Yeah, so just briefly, there's 5 that he talks about. One has to do with making it difficult to have any friends internationally. If other nations can't rely upon your word, don't know what you're going to do today or tomorrow, then they will decide, well, we're not going to rely on this country. And you'll find yourself friendless, or at least with fewer friends, or friends who have more conditions, right, for your friendship.
Which ties back to Washington's farewell address. Don't make too many promises, and don't make promises you cannot keep. Your word is your word when you're acting internationally, and you let others know, okay, you're acting right for the benefit of your political community. And there may be times where you have alliances with folks, but you try to stay out of the interworkings of other nations as much as you can. But when you do so for a time, and then you move on. But you're always following that principle in all your foreign activity.
A second one he talks about is the danger of just being uninformed about the law. And so, think about this today. One of the reasons why lawfare is a thing is not just because of the way our politics is so driven by hate of the other side, but also because there's opportunity, because there's so many laws on the books. And if you're enterprising, you can run for office in New York State and say, I will get Donald Trump. I'll figure it out how later, because there's enough laws out there. And so if we don't know what the law is, it can't really be a rule of action that people can follow and know, okay, as long as I do X, Y, and Z, I'm fine. I can go about my business. Not so when the laws multiply and the laws are unstable.
Yeah, I definitely today. I remember as a legislator how many laws
Mm.
were passed in the New Hampshire state legislature back in 2000. It's still probably the same today. You had 1,000 new laws every year that were being brought before you, and you never even read 90% of them, that were coming through. So it was hard even for the legislator at that point to understand how that law would make a change. But oftentimes, the intention behind passing this new law or this new policy, et cetera, whatever it may be, was the advantage of one party over another.
Well, I mentioned the next two already, just briefly at least. The way it dampens enterprise. And when the law is unstable, again, why would you start a business if you can't expect for the next 5 years, let's say, for the law to more or less be what it is today? I mean, whenever you have to plan a business, you have to think about what are the legal ramifications, the tax situation, the regulatory circumstances, and all those go into whether or not the business can be profitable, whether it makes sense to give it a go. And regardless of whether the taxes are going up or down or regulation is being increased or decreased, if it's constantly changing, that's costly. Right? You've got to keep up with that. That's your time. That's your money, perhaps, paying accountants and lawyers to keep up with these things for you. So all of that makes it more difficult for a person to move forward. And I also mentioned briefly the reality that those who are well connected benefit from this. That's not the many that benefit from laws changing regularly. We think about, well, we want them to be responsive to us in Washington. Whatever the polls say today, what the law to be tomorrow. But you don't really, because when the laws change that rapidly, you can't possibly keep up with it. And so, again, those regular folks are going to be left behind. Those who have the inside connections, those who have the well-paid lawyers and accountants on their team, they can manage it, at least relatively better than those who don't have those advantages.
Well, let's bring this up to the headlines today.
Yeah.
What are some of the examples of this mutability of the law and the danger of the mutability of the law today? I can think of one that is on the news cycle right now, and that is the gerrymandering wars in Texas and in California,
Yeah.
where arguments are being made that you've got a one-party politics in a state. You shove it down the other group's throat. So, what's the danger here of gerrymandering taken to the nth degree?
Well, I think it's actually a combination of our last two themes here, justice in contrast with faction and lawfulness. So, what are you really trying to do? You're trying to turn your 52% majority into 100% majority by designing districts that give you just enough votes so that your local factious majority, partisan majority, can win every seat, and then using that state legislative power, in order to establish this national preeminence, right? So it's really one faction trying to create another faction based upon a local faction. And so there's really nothing there about the common good. It's just about temporary, oftentimes passing partisan advantage.
Yeah, there's no need at a certain point if you know that you can win X amount of seats in the House of Representatives or in the U.S. Senate, whatever it may be, why argue and why argue well?
Right.
And why reason toward justice if reason is necessary, if you've got the seat under your control, no matter what? It does away with the intention toward justice because you just count what you have and what they have, and you have to have more than they have rather than making the case for why your type of representation would be better than another's, why your policies would be better than others, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Takes persuasion entirely out of the equation. Who needs persuasion? Who needs an attempt to build a consensus when you've got your elections rigged in such a way that you're going to win a certain number of seats, you've got it locked in, and it doesn't really matter what the policies are that are on offer or the values and virtues of the candidates.
Well, another issue that's out there right now, it's been around, we've been talking about it over a couple of shows, is the tariff policy. So how does tariff policy come into play here as well with lawfulness?
Right. Well, I think this is one where, you just see how much of it depends upon, I don't know, the mood of President Trump, whatever his sense of relations are with a given country or on a given manufactured good. Every day you read headlines read the Wall Street Journal, this business is now deciding to invest some money in American manufacturing because they figure, well, that'll save us on a tariff bill. This other business thinks, well, maybe not, because after all, this could all be over in 3 years' time, and we don't want to spend $1 billion on a factory here that we're then going to spend to then relocate it back to Mexico when the new regime comes in and the tariffs are lower. So uncertainty, right, creates these kind of bets, all of which are going to be inefficient because some are going to win, some are going to lose. But overall, it makes things less efficient because there's no stability. If you knew what the law was going to be for some period of time, and there weren't this constant appeals to emergencies that justify arbitrary tariff levels up and down and sideways, then you'd be able to make plans based upon the overall outlook you have for your business. But now a primary calculation here isn't, is there demand for my truck? Is there demand for my microchip? It's, no, what's the government going to do? What's the administration think? And what's the next administration going to think? And how do I maneuver my way to maintain some measure of profitability and market share in an ever-changing economic context?
So lawfulness and justice give way to the art of the deal.
Exactly.
And I think there's an example here too, right? We just read that Nvidia and AMD had cut a deal with the Trump administration to be able to sell their chips to China as long as they paid 15% of their profit, right, to the federal government, which is billions of dollars. There are many problems with this, but I guess the biggest problem is it undercuts the common good to the degree it undercuts our national security interests in selling China these microchips.
Right. I mean, the administration a couple months ago decided this was dangerous, right? We didn't want those microchips being sold to China. We wanted to maintain an advantage over them, especially with AI. Some of these chips anyway are very useful in training AI models, et cetera. So yeah, so that was their judgment, national security. Then Nvidia comes calling and says, hey, we're a $4 trillion company. We got some money we can throw around here. What if we were to give 15% of our revenue from these sales to the US government? Would that be interesting? And Trump says, oh, that is interesting. So for President Trump, when he shakes hands, the deal's done. Now, whatever legalities have to be worked out, that'll happen because it has to happen. This is the kind of thing we're talking about. This is expediency. This is utility. This is the law will bend to the policy. But it's kind of a big law to bend because after all, what's going on here is not just President Trump cutting a deal that allows for export license that wouldn't otherwise have been granted, but it also raises questions about whether what's really happening here is some sort of a export tax, which is explicitly forbidden in Article 1 of the Constitution. The Congress can't do that. Now, it's the president, okay? So say, well, that's not the Congress. But he's doing this supposedly under authority granted by a law passed by Congress. So there's some real mess here in terms of how you can reconcile all this with the Constitution, with a basic orientation toward obedience of the law. But it's just how we do things. And this is something we wrote about back in 2010. Obama administration was doing the same kind of deals, taking over GM, taking over Chrysler, coming out of the Great Recession and all the troubles they were having there, and other businesses, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and all these what become quasi public-private partnerships rather than independent businesses who are being asked to play whatever tune the government gives them, and who are oftentimes willing to do that because it guarantees their market share, guarantees their profitability to a certain degree, sometimes gives the public the losses while they get the gains, and provide some stability for them while the rest of us suffer at the expense of these seemingly arbitrary pronouncements by executives who don't really have this authority.
And of course, the argument that the Trump administration would make with this deal or with any of the other things that it's done is that we're moving toward a more just American society, right, that tends toward the betterment of Americans that have been left behind over the last 50 to 100 years, when other deals had been cut in a way that benefited the few and hurt the many. So the argument they'd make is that this is about justice, right? So it kind of brings us back to this tension between justice and the law, and begs the question, okay, if you're dealing with something that's unjust, or you have an unjust law, or you have had an unjust set of deals cut in the past, how do you proceed in a way where you tend toward the means of the law and the ends of justice?
Right. And this is where we can go back to Lincoln, because in the same speech we were just quoting earlier, Lincoln recognizes there are unjust laws. He's not foolish as a lawyer and as an intelligent person. He recognizes not every law is just. And even in some of the cases he's talking about, he recognizes the underlying injustice of the system that he's describing. But he argues that almost in every case, what you do, nevertheless, is obey the law until you change the law. And this is something that King talked about, the value in some ways of that kind of strict obedience, which points out the injustice of the law. And so sometimes you do civil disobedience in order to point out injustice that way, but sometimes it's by obedience itself that actually show you the injustice of a law, because as they see you obeying it, their conscience is pricked by the immorality of the underlying thing you're being asked to do. So there's a prudential question here in terms of how you best deal with laws that are unjust. But Lincoln's argument is you follow the law. This is the heavy presumption. You follow the law until you change the law. And that goes back to what you were talking about earlier with persuasion. If we just can arbitrarily push aside the law we don't like, well, it's been unjust, it's been a bad deal for so-and-so for 30 years, with a stroke of a pen, I'm going to fix that. Well, another stroke of the pen will bring it back, and perhaps worse. And so we lose touch with this principle of lawfulness, which is really the only hope we have for long-term, reasonably just society. That there's a general presumption on everybody's side that we follow the law, that the law has to be changed in an ordinary and regular way. It'll be slow, it'll be frustrating, but it will give everybody a chance to make their case. It'll require a measure of persuasion, consensus building, and an orientation toward the common good.
It seems to me, just in the discussion we just had about tariffs and gerrymandering, that what we're seeing, if you could imagine like the law was a chain of links, that the way we're going about it is we're adding an unjust link or law to previous unjust laws. And we think that if we just add that link, it undoes the other link, when what Lincoln is arguing here is repeal the bad link. Right. Don't add another bad link to a bad link. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, the chain is weakened, let's say, by every unjust law. And so as you keep adding them to try to fix the previous one, all you do is weaken overall the chain. And, the fifth point that Madison talked about under his case for the rule of law was that in the long run, and Lincoln points this out as well in the same address, in the long run, the worst thing that happens when the laws are not followed is that people lose their allegiance for popular government. They say, you know what, it's just not worth it. I need a despot. I need somebody who's going to bring law and order. I need somebody who's going to just settle all these disputes. And I just can't live under a system where every 2 years, every 4 years, everything gets turned upside down. I've got to have more stability than that. And so as much as they would love popular self-government and probably participate in it, the good citizen begins to doubt its virtue and decides, I'm not sure. Is a strong man better? Perhaps. If that strong man will at least be reliable in the kinds of things he does and will bring some order to the chaos I'm experiencing.
And I think another thing that's happening here is that dueling persuasive arguments for what is just go by the wayside. Mm-hmm. You'd rather have a greater amount of certitude, right, in getting force on your side than in persuading the other that they may be looking at the issue in the wrong way. And this has, by the way, 150-year, 175-year tradition in American political culture. I think that is born out of the Civil War and born out of a new American regime that comes after that Civil War that questions the goodness of making dual arguments for justice. That here's Oliver Wendell Holmes arguing, right, probably the most powerful influence over American law the last 150 years, that certitude leads to violence. That certitude about justice leads to violence. So what's his remedy for that? A law that is little by little up with the times, being changed, and that type of legal modification over time, he'll argue, is better than having a civil war and fighting it out over dueling visions of justice. But as we're saying here, there's a danger to that, because I think what's happening in reality is you can go from having kind of a lawful process to adding chain links to that chain.
Mm-hmm.
But over time, if you lose trust that the chain means anything, that the chain is just, then you've lost everything.
Yeah, and if you lose confidence that the next group to be in power will actually respect the chain and will be willing to add their own modest links to the chain. I mean, I understand why there's this desire to do things quickly and powerfully in this administration, when we've seen the prevailing tendency for 100 plus years of progressives to go far beyond the Constitution, to use executive power as they need it, to create whatever crisis is necessary in order to justify their actions. And so I understand why there's the desire to sweep all that away as much as you can in as little time as possible in order to try to even scores, or to, restore something of a previous way of life. But the problem is, what's lost along the way is the habits of Republican government. And those aren't coming back if we, on left and right, decide we're done with lawfulness.
Yeah, because that's not conservatism. Because conservative, what are you trying to conserve? Well, we're trying to conserve the integrity of the chain, and its tie to what is justice. But we're acting like them when we add those links, right? That in which we get our thing when we want it now. So there's another issue here, and we'll quickly cover this issue, this tension between law and necessity, because life is filled with contingency, and you can have a set of laws and they can apply well to the situation that you're living in, but then new situations arise. So what do you do with a law when a new necessity comes forward, and what's a right understanding of how to deal with necessity given the laws that are in place?
This is a very difficult issue, and it's one that's, philosophers have worked on for a while. You think about Aristotle's discussion of the rule of law as sort of a second best regime, right? But what's better than that? The rule of the wise. If you knew in every instance what to do, you wouldn't need laws. This is why God doesn't need to rule by law. He rules by decree, because God has perfect knowledge of every contingency. In fact, there are no contingencies for God. So therefore, he can simply decree in the moment exactly what is right. But we don't have that ability in our understanding. So we need general rules in order to understand what works most of the time, right? Most of the time. So what happens when it's not most of the time, when it's one of those crises? And here we can think about philosophers like John Locke, who have given us some insight about this, and others who have dealt with this question of contingency, of what Locke calls prerogative, right? How would Locke use prerogative, Dave, in order to deal with the gaps or the weaknesses of the law?
Well, it would attune wisdom that is hoped for in the ruler with the end of the public good. So the ruler must be thinking in a time of an emergency or in a time of necessity, if I act in a way that is going to tend toward the public good, that's going to tend toward justice, and other parties aren't around to allow for this act to be done, if the act is necessary to maintain the political community and its public good over the long run, that's the rule. But this isn't something that you do willy-nilly, like, oh, okay,
right,
it's an emergent. This is the emergency for today, and I'm going to act. I'm going to use the power that I have. And by the way, I think it's about the public good, but it's more. I just think this needs to be done. So there's a way to abuse Locke's system of prerogative, but at its core is the idea that there is this end called the public good. There is a time where human wisdom must come into play, and a decision must be made for that public good, because the law doesn't have the ability to do so in that circumstance.
Yeah, and when we deal with this in the book, we talk about real necessity versus pretend necessity. And it's the fault of executives in particular over the last century plus to make what are sometimes, I think, cynical, maybe sometimes sincere, but misguided, appeals to necessity to say, well, we just can't follow the old rules. We can't follow the Constitution. We can't follow the fundamental laws because those are getting in the way of some really important things right now. And, we did a little research on this. Apparently, we have 52 currently ongoing national emergencies. So back in 1976, coming out of Vietnam and Watergate, the Congress was in the mood to rein in the executive, and there's a number of laws that reflect that. War Powers Act, probably the most famous and prominent. But there was also a National Emergencies Act that was passed. And what they did was they discovered that there were, over the last 50 years, over 400 examples of where Congress had given the executive power for an emergency that they never repealed it. And so they did kind of a blanket repeal of all those open-ended grants of power and then set up some parameters moving forward. Well, not surprisingly, as soon as they had done that, then now there's a new set of rules. Presidents figure out how that goes. And so we've had repeatedly over the last, say, quarter century particularly, presidents declaring one emergency after another and then using the declaration of that emergency as justification for oftentimes negotiating international deals. Sometimes think about what's happened more recently with the deployment of federal forces in Washington, D.C., right? These appeals to emergencies, real or imagined, necessity, real or imagined, multiply. And so what's supposed to be the kind of normal default of following the law, that becomes the exception rather than the rule. And governing under emergency powers becomes the default rather than the exception.
And I mentioned the broad applicability of these questions that we're talking about to life. You think about how many organizations we've been a part of where someone says, this is a 911 call. Yeah. And you're like, okay, this is bad, right? Not a good situation, but you don't need to call 911 every time someone stubs a toe. Yeah. But what you're being called on to do oftentimes, this is not only a leader who takes the prerogative wrongly, but those who are led, who want the leader to act, they want the strong man response. Right. They want you to, out of an issue, to make the decision right now and change things right now because this is an emergency. And we see this in family life. We see it in church life. Mm-hmm. We see it. I've led schools that are like this. And we have a tendency in that situation to fabricate necessity rather than ask, is this really kind of a great danger?
Right. And it's just because we're impatient. We think we see the solution. We overestimate the danger. And so we feel like we've got to act right in that moment. And if we don't, some terrible consequences will follow. I mean, that's been the state of our politics for several cycles. I think back to the Flight 93 election essay back in 2016. And then what was the urgency of losing our democracy in 2020 and 2024. I mean, these are existential stakes that are being presented to the American people. And so then when you win the election, then the urgency doesn't go away just because you won the election. Now you have all the things that you were fearing, all the policies that have been put in place, all the regulations or tendencies in the culture that need to be addressed right now. Otherwise, this thing is lost forever. And the irony is that in choosing to act in that way, you're actually losing the precious thing that you're purporting to save. Right? Democracy or republicanism is actually being lost by these urgent efforts to save it, whether cynically or sincerely meant.
So in sum, there are true necessities that require prerogative. However, we can't fabricate necessity in a way where we're constantly changing the law or the law will be undercut. And I think kind of leaving it there is a good way to finish out our discussion for today.
Agreed. Yeah. And so we'll wrap things up next time with the topic of prudence, which in some ways is the thing that ties it all together from the standpoint of the virtues of a statesman, having that practical wisdom to understand how to navigate murky waters, all those contingencies, all those challenges. We have the theory, but we have to translate that into practice. And that's where prudence comes in. So we'll have more to say about that in a couple of weeks' time. But before we wrap it up, of course, Tocqueville's crystal ball. I know everyone's been waiting on the edge of their seat to hear how Saratoga went, Dave. Remember last time you had a $200 budget, and the question was essentially how much we're going to lose. Right? We were not overly optimistic about coming away ahead, And so you thought you'd lose $120. I thought you would lose 109. So how'd it go?
Well, you thought I'd be a big winner on day one and then just
Squander. Yeah.
squander at day two.
Yeah.
Traffic on the Mass Turnpike affected the outcome
Okay.
of where things ended up because we thought in leaving Boston at 11:30 to head to Saratoga, which is about a 3.5 hour ride, that we'd get there and be able to have a full day.
Yeah.
And yet we hit traffic in Worcester. And we didn't get there until about 4:30. There were, I think, 4 races left and out of 10 on day one. So I'm like, I have $100. I'm just going all in these 4 races. I think I lost my shirt day one, but I actually did the reverse of what you thought would happen.
Okay.
So day two, I was much more methodical. I went back to my fundamentals of horse racing.
Yeah.
And I started off slow with smaller bets and was able to recoup most of my money and only lost $60 out of the whole thing. So I came out ahead of where I thought I'd be.
Yeah.
So the traffic helped me in that situation, but I can't say it enough. Like if you live in that area, to go up there, it's such a great family event.
Yeah.
You've got some people who are really dressed up, some people who are dressed down. But it's a lot of joy, and even in losing, there's joy there. But we also made some predictions about what the Red Sox would do.
Mm-hmm.
I went big and thought they'd get Joe Ryan, which they didn't do. Although there were reports that day that they had him, and
there was talk.
I was on the plane being like, I'm right, I got this right, and then I got off the plane and it was all a farce. So we got two kind of end of the rotation, kind of middle reliever types. We're still kind of hanging in there, Matt. But I don't know, Steven Matz, Dustin May,
yeah, exactly. I mean, both guys that 5 years ago would have been much more interesting than they were in 2025, but that's also why they were available at a pretty cut rate price. So, yeah, I mean, the Red Sox front office clearly thought about this year as a step forward year, but not the year to go for it. And I get that they were hoping to play 3 rookies, a couple second year guys, it's a young team, traded for Crochet. And so is he going to be ready year one to really be an ace? Obviously he has been, but so you can see why that was probably their mindset coming into the season. And they're just not going away from that. And they just weren't going to go all in. I mean, the Twins traded everybody else away. They got rid of 10 guys off their 26-man roster in the last couple of days before the deadline, but not Joe Ryan. So he's still there toiling away and beat the Yankees the other night. So I'm grateful for that. At least that was one benefit of him staying on the Twins.
So the wild card is definitely within reach. We're there right now. I'm just a little afraid if we have to go into Seattle and we put Crochet up day one, and then what do we have after Crochet, right? And you look at the Mariners starting 5, and you're okay. Any one of those 5 guys is probably better than our number 2 guy. So
all right. Well, the more to say about that in the weeks to come, but we do want to throw out a few new predictions just to entertain the audience as always with the folly of what we propose. But college football is coming soon. In fact, a week from this weekend is the first couple of games. But we're going to predict some of the big matchups, which are the following weekend. So these will actually still be future games when the next episode comes out, but just barely so. Get a little bit ahead of things here because we know we want to predict NFL, for that episode. So we've got some really juicy matchups. The AP Top 25 came out this week. Texas was number 1, Penn State number 2, Ohio State number 3. Texas and Ohio State are playing that first week.
Amazing.
At Ohio State, yeah. So we want to talk about that. We've got Alabama at Florida State, which, used to be a great matchup. Florida State coming off a horrible season, but it's talking about significant improvement there. LSU at Clemson, that's another big SEC, ACC matchup. Notre Dame at Miami. Reminds me of the old Catholics versus convicts battles of the late 80s. And then got to do Belichick's first game, TCU at North Carolina. So we got 5 games, Dave. Give me the winner. And then a tiebreaker kind of bonus. Which team scores the most points of the winners in those 5 games, and how many they score?
I think Ohio State upsets. I think they're favored in this game because it's at home, but
Yeah.
they beat Texas, and it's just this crazy shootout type of game. One of those games that are memorable for many reasons.
Yeah.
So they win that game. I don't think Florida State is going to beat Alabama, even though they're playing at home. So I'm going to go with Alabama there.
Yeah.
I'm going to go with LSU over Clemson. So they're going to go into Clemson. That'll be a big upset.
Mm-hmm.
And then I mentioned earlier my daughter's boyfriend, Cam. So I've got to go with the home team. Well, Notre Dame's playing at Miami, but I got to go with Notre Dame over Miami.
Yeah.
They've become kind of our household college team because of Cam. So,
okay.
And then Belichick, of course. We're going to North Carolina will beat TCU, and I think he'll make it interesting all year, especially if they get off to a good start.
Yeah.
He'll have that magic, and we'll be talking about Belichick once again as the greatest coach of all time. So,
yeah.
Who gets the most points? I said that the Ohio State Texas game will be a shootout. I'm going with Ohio State with 45 points.
Nice. Okay. Well, I agree with most of those. I'm taking Texas over Ohio State. Arch Manning goes wild. His first start. I mean, he started a couple of games as an injury fill-in, but now as the undisputed starting quarterback there, I think he has a big game and takes down Ohio State. I've got Alabama, Clemson over LSU. I think at home, they've kind of found their mojo again, so I think Clemson wins that one. I'm going to take Miami at home again over Notre Dame, and then I'll also take North Carolina. So I've got Alabama as the highest scoring team. I think they put a big number on Florida State. Florida State's defense is not ready, I don't think, for Alabama. So I say they score 51 points on Florida State, and there's all of a sudden, some more buzz about firing coaches and crises and everything down there in Tallahassee. But it'll be a good start to the college football season. I don't think we've ever had a year with so many really big matchups to lead things off. So this is really going to be setting the table for lots of questions around the playoff and end of the year. Some of these games might make a difference in who's in and who's out.
Yeah, I think they've definitely changed their way of scheduling in which they want to get on the map early. Whereas it used to be like, okay, University of New Hampshire versus Penn State.
Right.
Okay. The spread is 65 points.
Right.
So, yeah, anyway, good stuff. It's good to have football back.
Yep, that'll be fun. All right, well, we're going to wrap it up there for today. Thank you, as always, for joining us. If you want to reach out to us, you can do so through our email at democracyinamericatoday@gmail.com. We'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
2020 vision.